In this chapter, we will be demonstrating the percussion section of the orchestra, and these instruments don't have the articulation options that are available to the strings and other instruments that we have shown in previous sections. In general, you simply have dynamics that control volume. But what you lack in articulation options, you gain in the variety of instruments available to you. And so we have prepared a variety of percussion instruments with which to demonstrate this. The first one in the list is the Cine Samples Orchestral Percussion preset, which is part of the Cine Symphony Light library. Even though this is a light version, it includes virtually all of the standard percussion instruments that you might use in orchestral works. If we start at the top of the keyboard and play downwards, the first instrument we hear is the Glockenspiel. And this belongs to the tuned percussion instrument section. So this is an instrument that can be used melodically. Below this, we have a variety of cymbals, gongs, woodblocks, shakers, and toms, etc. As we can hear, this preset includes reverb. And the instruments are once again ready to be used straight out of the box. If we compare this patch to, say, a typical drum patch on a sampler, it is laid out in a very similar fashion. But there is no standard MIDI layout for orchestral instruments. So different libraries will have different layouts when playing over MIDI. As you can see, it is quite straightforward to create interesting rhythms, and we don't have to worry about playing polyphonically, as each note contains a separate sample, and the issue of phasing shouldn't arise. Also, when playing the keyboard, it is quite easy to create the typical flam effect. As we go lower down the keyboard, we get to the lower toms and the snare instruments. And the snare instruments in this library respond exceptionally well to velocity. When playing harder on the keyboard, there is a lot more snap to the sound, much like there would be in reality. There would be no reason to control this articulation from a MIDI controller in general, so using MIDI velocity makes sense. As we get to the far left of this keyboard layout, we get to a very important instrument in orchestral terms, and that is the tubular bells. It is not necessarily something that you will use every day, but there are plenty of examples of it being used in classical orchestral music, and even in popular music, as for example in Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield. This keyboard layout would probably suffice for the majority of typical orchestral work. This would be an excellent place to start. The range of percussion instruments available to the orchestra is huge, and it would be easy to get lost with an extremely large library, when a library such as this will give you all the instruments you need most of the time. It's clear to see here that Cine Symphony Light only has a small range of patches or instruments, but it covers almost everything you would require in orchestral music. The next library we have is the Orchestral Essentials library. This has more or less the same instruments as the previous library, but obviously it sounds different. And we have a very useful instrument here, which is the snare roll. And there are two options. This allows us to play snare rolls by simply holding our finger down, rather than trying to perform a snare roll on the keyboard, which would almost certainly not sound as natural. The next library is the Albion 1 XXL percussion library, which is a more specialist library. We can hear that this is a very powerful library. To be fair, it is a touch louder than the previous libraries, and the reverb is more present. But even taking that into consideration, we can hear just how powerful it is. It also has some more advanced articulation options when compared to the previous libraries. Next, from the same developer, we have the Darwin Percussion Ensemble library. This is another specialized library, and is certainly a very useful library for more modern classical pieces. It ranges from metal percussion down to very low drums. This library would clearly be very useful for powerful pieces or film work. The next library we come to is an older library, and it is from Sound Iron, a company that used to be called Tonehammer, and this is a marching drums library. This library is somewhat naked as it is, but this is not necessarily a bad thing. The reverb in other libraries can make everything sound impressive. But here we have a much drier library. And of course, we have the option to add reverb to this later if we wish. And this can make mixing easier and even better. Moving on, from the same company, we have the Epic Toms library. And here they have added reverb, and a lot of it. To be honest, it would be hard to have Epic Toms that were dry. But as you can hear, these are certainly very powerful and dramatic sounding drums. One very nice thing about this library is that I can control the wet-dry balance of the reverb using the modulation wheel. By playing the instrument dry, and then adding the reverb, it certainly proves just how important reverb is when creating a large-sounding percussion instrument. It is also important that the reverb fits the specific task, and isn't too long, or that there isn't too much of it. One thing you may have noticed is that in playing these libraries, there are certain typical performance elements when playing drums. And our next library, which is a timpani library, has some of these patterns and rolls recorded into the library. So we don't have to perform them ourselves, but we simply trigger the desired timpani roll. The library is the Orchestral Essentials 2 library, and this is an additional library to the original Orchestral Essentials library. It does not replace that library, but it expands it. If I hold this note, we can hear a typical timpani roll, and if I move the modulation wheel, it affects the dynamics of that roll, in effect functioning like the expression controller on the legato samples from previous chapters. The keyboard is laid out with the rolls on the left and the single hits on the right. And if, for example, you play a roll on the F key down here, the identical timpani, but as a single hit, is on the F up here. This is important, as timpani instruments are tuned, and so, if a piece of music is performed in C minor, for example, then the timpani has to also play in C. I can also control the modulation with a foot pedal, as an example. So usually you would play the roll and end it with a single hit. And that hit could be on the same note or, for example, on the same note but an octave lower. Later on in our tutorial, you will see the timpani and many other percussion instruments being used extensively in the epic examples we have prepared. In the next library, the Orchestral Essentials library, we have some cinematic percussive effects. This has a variety of more atmospheric sounds and some different drum rolls and single hits, as well as some tuned timpani effects. One part of the percussion instrumentation that we have not covered are the cymbals, so we can quickly look at the Albion One cymbals and gongs presets. Here we have a selection of cymbals that already have reverb on them, and we can hear a selection of swells too. Swells are obviously an important part of orchestral composition, especially when transitioning between sections. You can control the length of the sample by simply lifting your finger when you want the swell to end, or you can hold the key down and it will end naturally on its own. Once again, this is a technique that is often used in not just classical music, but popular music as well. The next library we are going to look at is a more recent type of library from Sonokinetic, and this is the Capriccio library and the pitched percussion patch. This is ideal for someone who perhaps does not wish to perform the classical patterns themselves, as perhaps they are simply inexperienced, or they are a composer and arranger who is looking for more realism. And the reason this library is an excellent option for those users is that it actually plays back performances rather than single samples. The initial look of this library is somewhat confusing, but it does make sense when you know what you are looking at. The screen is divided into three sections. the top being the higher phrases, the middle being the middle phrases, and the bottom being the lower phrases. In fact, it is a phrase sampler. It plays back phrases, and so simply by holding the keys down, those phrases are replayed. If we click here, we can see the individual phrases that are available from within each instrument. You can also preview them by clicking the speaker icon. You also have the possibility to see the phrases in musical score form, which also has the advantage of you being able to see how specific phrases are played, and you can reproduce them yourself if you wish to. The second example is the xylophone. And by looking at the musical score for this, you can understand exactly how a specific musical effect is created. The third and lower instrument is a piano. By playing the chords we wish to hear on the keyboard, all of the phrases will play simultaneously and in key. Of course, you have a variety of phrases available to you. And the nice thing about this is not only that you can use them as phrases in your music, but you can learn how these phrases are created and use them with any library. You also have the option to drag the MIDI data from the plugin onto a MIDI track, and as long as the instrument on your MIDI track is in the correct range, it will play back the MIDI data and give you the possibility to use whatever instrument you wish. In this example, the piano has been replaced by the tubular bells. If we look at the section with the xylophone, we can see the dynamics in the score, and this also allows you to hear how those dynamics work in reality. So this instrument is not only an excellent sounding tool, but is also quite educational. Also available in the Capriccio library is the normal percussion instrument, in other words, the unpitched instruments. Once again, we can look at the musical score for these phrases. As we have seen previously, the preset is divided into 3 sections. The first section plays this pattern. The second plays this pattern, in which we can clearly hear the dynamics that are present in the phrase recording. You can hardly hear the 2 middle notes, but they are there, and certainly this subtlety can lead to much richer arrangements. If we now look at the third section, or the lower section, we can see that this is a constant rhythmic pattern. If we look at the score, we can see that there are directions as to how to play this, with the left and right hands, and also which notes to accentuate. If we play them all together, we can see that the bottom pattern is giving the groove or rhythm, and the top 2 are defining the accents. This would be considered a typical method, having one of the parts playing rhythmically and the others accentuating that rhythm. In effect, it sounds like one instrument playing, but it is a combination of the 3 patterns. Now we can look at a few different patterns included in the Capriccio percussion library.